Rue, we're matching. Rue, we're matching. See, I'm a cat and you're a cat. And I'm wearing black and you're wearing black. We look so cute together. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckisphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You have entered my deep dives where I basically sit on my bed and talk about a super deep and complicated topic while sipping tea. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, make sure that you hit that subscribe button below. And yeah, let's go ahead and get into today's topic, which is quite a doozy. So today we're going to talk about how the United States can get towards 50% emissions drop by 2030, which is Biden's goal, without the Clean Energy Protection Program, or CEPP, and without any form of carbon or methane tax. Because the same reason that we're not doing the CEPP is the same reason we're not doing the taxes, and that is Joe Manchin. Let me get into it. Basically, we're currently trying to pass the infrastructure bill and the spending package, and the spending package has been recently reduced down from $3.5 trillion down to $2 trillion, and one of the main pieces that is getting dropped is the CEPP. Now, the CEPP was kind of an extremely big deal because it had the potential to get us to where we need to be to follow the Paris Agreement, basically. And it would help get us to 100% clean energy by 2035, which is one of Biden's goals. The energy sector is the second most polluting sector in the US behind transportation, and this had the opportunity to drop US emissions by 82% compared to 2005 levels by 2030. So would have been a very big deal. And then West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin happened, and he nixed it. Despite receiving multiple letters from experts around the nation supporting the CEPP, saying that it would be good for the economy, the environment, and human health. But, you know, Manchin is frankly blinded by fossil fuel money. He receives more money from fossil fuels than any other member of Congress. Not only mention that, but him and his family have a $1 to $5 million worth of shares in a coal broker firm called Ender Systems, which basically represents about 71% of his investment income. Now, even though he himself no longer owns it, though he did own it before he became senator, owned the shares anyways, now his son owns it. So we can't make the argument about, well, what about future generations? He's looking out for his future generation. On top of that, ExxonMobil's rep in the recent Greenpeace leak called Joe Manchin the kingmaker and say that they call and talk quite often. So somehow that Democrat ended up being the most important Democrat in the room, and suddenly the biggest climate pieces of the spending bill are out. So honestly, I thought that the CEPP was somehow going to continue to make it in the spending bill. I guess call me naive, but I thought that maybe the progressives who were really trying to hold on to it would actually manage to keep it in there. But luckily for us, the Rhodium Group basically saw what was going to happen. And so they recently, earlier this month, published a report where they laid out how the United States can get to 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 without the CEPP or any form of methane or carbon tax. Because again, Joe Manchin has specifically said that he would not support either of those. One thing that is interesting about this report is that it's not really focusing on dropping fossil fuel production in the United States. Instead, they are working on dropping the demand for fossil fuel products, eventually kind of making fossil fuels no longer relevant. The report states specifically that oil and gas production in the US probably won't change much under current policy or through this new scenario. So first of all, what is the Rhodium Group? Well, the Rhodium Group is an independent research project that combines economic data and policy insight to analyze global trends. This most recent study was funded by the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation, Hewitt as in HP, it's the H, and Linden Trust for Conservation to look at how the US can reach Biden's goal of 50% emissions reduction by 2030 under current policies. So let's first look at where we're currently at and where we're projected to go under current policies without this scenario. So under current policies as of May 2021, with no new action, the US is on track of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by about 17 to 25% below 2005 levels by 2030. The largest emissions producing sector by 2030 would be industrial, followed by transportation and then energy. So you can see how those two kind of dropped a little bit, and industry is now the top one. Those three sectors represent 83 to 87% of US emissions by 2030. Carbon capture technology reduces a minimal amount of emissions overall based on current projections, only enough to basically cover building emissions, which buildings are the lowest emission sector, so not great. In order to make up for this emissions gap, the US would need to drop emissions equivalent to the entire state of Florida for every year for the next 9 years, which is about 5.2 to 5.9% drop each year. Now, there's only been 2 years that we have come close to doing that we were not in a recession. And that was 2012 and 2016, so during the Obama era. But even then, we only got to a 4% emissions drop. We never actually got to that 5 point anything. So this would definitely be a historical move. Joint action is key. The Rhodium Report takes a joint action approach when reducing national emissions. Joint action is a combination between Congress's efforts, executive branch's efforts, and subnational leaders' efforts like state governors or corporation executives. Combined, the Rhodium Group says that the actions they recommend can cut the US net greenhouse gas emissions to 45 to 51% below 2005 levels by 2030. Hey, that totally gets us there. Quote, our analysis demonstrates that meeting the US's 2030 target is achievable if Congress, the executive branch, and subnational leaders all take a series of practical and feasible policy actions, what we refer to as our joint action scenario. The analysis represents a combination between the infrastructure package, the spending bill, and a steady stream of regulations and standards. The cool thing is that all the federal regulatory actions that are implemented in the scenario can be done so with the existing legal authorities. So we're not asking for anything that has never been allowed before. Quote, success means that by 2030, the power grid is much cleaner, the majority of consumers are choosing electric vehicles over gasoline, buildings are increasingly electrified and efficient, and carbon capture is a normal part of the industrial landscape. Shifts in carbon removal, forestry, and agriculture and other sectors will also be underway. Meanwhile, the US will be scaling up emerging technologies like direct air capture, clean hydrogen, long-duration storage, and clean fuels to drive the next wave of decarbonization beyond 2030. The US achieves 72 to 74% clean energy generation in 2030 under this joint action scenario, compared to only 45 to 55% under current policy. 39 to 41% of total reductions in this scenario comes from the power sector, so it's very power sector heavy. The joint action scenario can also result in a 16 to 17% drop in transportation emissions through a combined executive action to make EV adoption faster and leadership states prioritizing public transportation and lower emissions travel methods and other methods that reduce travel demand. Industrial emissions in this scenario drops 21%. The building sector drops emissions by 6% compared to current policies in 2030. Switching to clean energy via this scenario can reduce harmful air pollutants. Air pollution causes about 7 million premature deaths every year, and the plan could drop sulfur dioxide emissions by 68 to 89% below 2020 levels by 2030, and nitrogen oxide emissions by 59 to 63% below 2020 levels by 2030. The scenario also can save households about $500 a year in energy costs by 2030 by utilizing tax credits, increasing energy efficiency, and reducing the demand for natural gas. So as they did, let's go ahead and first look at what can be provided by the infrastructure bill and the spending package, assuming that there is no major changes that we don't know about at this point. For the infrastructure package, transmission facilitation program by the Department of Energy will make interstate transmission lines easier to build. The Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program will provide low-cost capital for build-out of CO2 pipelines and funding for CO2 storage reservoir characterization and storage permitting. And it will also bring down future tech costs by funding regional deployment hubs for direct air capture and hydrogen projects and funding for R&D for hydrogen, carbon capture, direct air capture, energy storage, etc. The spending package has an extension and enhancement of clean energy tax credits, EV infrastructure investments, it builds energy efficiency tax credits, it funds natural carbon removal methods like forest restoration in public, private, and tribal lands, and carbon smart agriculture practices through existing programs. So hopefully lawmakers have read Rhodium's previous report that they published in July, which looks at clean energy tax incentives. They found that $25 per megawatt hour, or 30% of investment costs, allow for developers to choose the best credit, not having to worry as much about different variables. And it will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. So I hope they looked at that.
Hey, it's Editing Becky, and before we get into some of the things that the executive branch can do, I forgot to mention other things that the congressional policies can do via the joint action scenario. So let's take a look at those first. So the Rhodium Group recommends that they apply a clean electricity tax credit, which at full value, long-term, flexible clean energy tax credits for new zero-emitting electric generation and grid improvement with provisions for direct pay. They also recommend nuclear support. We mentioned that some countries in Europe were starting to move in that direction, and now the US is backing some more nuclear support as well. So those would be grants and tax credits available through 2031 for distressed nuclear plants. They recommend rural cooperative incentives, which is basically funding for rural electric cooperatives to accelerate decarbonization efforts. So that could be like community solar, for example. They recommend carbon capture tax credits, which would be an extension and increase in payout of those Section 45Q carbon capture tax credit, including a new credit level for direct air capture, because that's not a thing yet. They recommend EV tax credits as well, which is an extension of the EV tax credit at $7,500 per vehicle with no manufacturer cap and higher credit values for meeting certain labor and domestic production criteria. They also are pushing for EV charging infrastructure at $7.5 billion in grants for build-outs for public charging stations. Clean fuel and hydrogen tax credits as well, which would be new and expanded production of tax credits for clean transportation fuels and clean hydrogen. Energy efficiency spending, which is increased funding for efficiency upgrades through the Weatherization Assistance State Energy Program and Energy Efficiency Community Block Grants. They recommend building efficiency tax credits, which would be an extension and expansion of the energy efficiency tax credits for residential and commercial buildings. and electrification and efficiency grants. So you can see there are a lot of tax credits and grants for the congressional policies. So that one would be funding for grant programs for residential electrification and efficiency upgrades. They're recommending well and mine mitigation. So that would be funding for reclamation of abandoned coal mines and remediation of abandoned oil and gas wells, which is very much needed because a lot of them are leaking right now. And then finally, they're also recommending soil conservation and forest reforestation, which would be $28 billion in new funds to existing conservation programs at the USDA, and stepped up funding for reforestation on federal, non-federal, public, private, and tribal lands and urban forests. So those are the recommendations for the congressional policies for this joint action scenario.
The departments that play the largest role in decarbonizing are the EPA, the Department of Energy or DOE, and the USDA. Most of them, it's really the EPA though. So let's first look at what they're going to do. New Source Performance Standards, or NSPS, for all new fossil fuel electric generators to meet carbon dioxide emissions rates equivalent to 90% carbon capture by 2022. Existing source performance standards, or ESPS, for all of those fossil fuel power plants that cannot be covered by the NSPS, with binding requirements by 2026 and requiring 80% emissions reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. Light-duty vehicles, greenhouse gas standards that begin ramping down acceptable emissions levels by 2023, achieving 90 grams of greenhouse gas emissions per mile standard by 2030. Mid-duty and heavy-duty vehicle greenhouse gas standards that require 50% faster annual improvements in new vehicle emissions rates than current standards starting in 2028, which basically gives time for the technology to catch up. NSPS for all new chemical factories, LNG import and export, and petrochemical refineries to meet carbon dioxide emissions intensities equal to 90% carbon capture starting in 2022 to 2023. ESPS for all of those not subject to NSPS above, with binding carbon capture requirements on certain equipment phased in by 2027 or 2028. ESPS on methane emissions for oil and gas production not subjected to NSPS recently stated to start in 2025. That last one is basically the only move that would directly increase the production costs for fossil fuels, but only marginally. The analysis especially likes existing source performance standards, or ESPS, because they overlap with tax credits, grid and carbon capture investments obtained in the infrastructure and budget packages. Because of that, it reinforces emissions reduction goals, even if, for example, natural gas prices are lower than expected or renewable energy prices are higher than expected. And as you might have noticed, a lot of fossil fuel policies would require carbon capturing built into these new facilities. And right now, there's hardly any infrastructure in place to store or ship CO2. So the report calls for congressional extensions and enhancements to the Section 45Q carbon capture tax credit that's already kind of in existence right now. And the Rhodium Group thinks that tax credits and money towards clean energy programs will help convince the industry to push the needle in the right direction towards more carbon capturing. Or if they can't do it, then they don't get to build new plants. They also say that if there's a border adjustment mechanism that was added to the budget package, then that could actually lessen the concerns about international competitiveness as we're moving in that direction. With all of these efforts, the group sees that carbon capture technology becomes price comparable about as fast as utility scaled solar. So that's a pretty ambitious thought right there. They also say that carbon capture industry has the potential of producing thousands of new jobs and reduces the emissions of fossil fuels sources by 48 to 49% by 2030 compared to current trajectory. So that's a pretty big one right there. And that's all with the production not really slowing down. Note that they specifically focused on decarbonizing LNG terminals, chemical manufacturing, and refineries. LNG I didn't say before, but that's liquid natural gas. So that's what that means. That's because they deem that to be the fastest growing and largest emitting industry subsectors, and they say that the EPA has not attempted to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in those areas of industry, only in oil and gas. So that is an area that's currently being missed. The paper recognizes the challenges on the EPA's hands to get regulations to those three, because we know how hard it is to get anything on fossil fuels or petrochemical companies, because they fight it at every form. The Rhodium Group also gave some recommendations for the Department of Energy, or DOE, and the Department of Agriculture, or USDA, to drop emissions. Definitely a lot less recommendations than they gave to the EPA though. The DOE can exercise the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which adopts the most ambitious minimum efficiency standards for covered equipment that prioritizes emissions reductions, and the USDA can leverage discretionary spending under the CCC, the Commodities Credit Corps, which can be focused on climate smart agriculture and operational changes that prioritize carbon sequestration, aka sucking the carbon out of the soil. They recommend ramping up the CCC's spending on that pursuit from nothing, we're doing nothing now, to $9 billion by 2030. It could result in 42 to 60% improvement in carbon uptake by the agricultural sector by 2030 compared to current policies. So that's a big one. The analysis did not include banning new fossil fuel projects on federal lands, because they don't think that that will make a lot of a dent in emissions for just the next decade, and they're focusing on just trying to drop emissions for the next decade. It also did not include things that the current administration hasn't shown any interest in utilizing, such as the renewable fuels standard. Now let's look at what states can do, specifically what are considered the leadership states, which are the 25 states in the US Climate Alliance. If you want to know more about the US Climate Alliance or what states are involved, also a link in the description below. So here's some of the things that the leadership states could do. They could adopt clean electricity standards, or CESs, that move them towards 100% clean energy by 2035. So basically what Biden wanted to do on the federal level, they could do on the state level. They could use the infrastructure funds to create utility clean power projects targeted at 100% clean power by 2035. They could develop their own light-duty vehicles, zero emissions vehicle mandates that require 100% zero emissions vehicle new sales by 2035. And for mid to heavy duty vehicles, they could get to 100% zero emissions for those sales by 2045. They could also adopt low carbon fuel standards to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel by 20% by 2030. They could reduce vehicle miles traveled, though the analysis did not really specify further how, so I'm guessing like public transportation. They could reduce agricultural and waste methane by 40% from 2013 levels by 2030. They could also reduce nitrogen oxide, another potent greenhouse gas, through changes in crop management practices. And leadership states can adopt or revamp their energy efficiency resource standards to achieve 2.5% electricity savings and 1.25% natural gas savings annually. That is the main points that they recommend for the executive branch, for Congress, and for subnational leaders. Risks and additional opportunities. There's of course a chance that there will be more cuts to the infrastructure and budget packages. There's also risks associated with ambition, legality, elections, and technology that might make this scenario not pan out as stated in the report. In case that happens, the Rhodium Group also provided a list of additional opportunities that could be explored. So let's take a look at some of those. We could put a price on carbon similar to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, in the Northeast. They also referenced California's AB 32 Act, which was implemented in 2006, and I'll link that below. I don't know much about that. I will also link the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, below, because I don't know much about either of those, frankly. It's something for future research. There's always more. The EPA could also utilize the Clean Air Act by including greenhouse gas emissions to the list of regulated gases and require states to create plans to reduce those emissions. That's one of my favorite things personally, and I'm surprised they haven't tried to do that so far. Well, kind of surprised. Anyways, the Renewable Fuel Standard implemented in 2005, which requires sales of a set volume of renewable transportation fuel, can be continued and enhanced past 2022. And if you're wondering what renewable transportation fuel is, that's another thing I don't know. So if you can look at that up and put it in the comment section below, that'd be great. The EPA might also have the authority to create a cap and trade program. States could also expand their use of carbon pricing. The RGGI that I mentioned earlier could expand to include more states or sectors, or more states could adopt something similar to California's act. Some states are contemplating a transportation climate initiative to decrease road fuel emissions. More states could also implement the low carbon fuel standards like the West Coast. There is also value in reducing the resources available for fossil fuel companies, like restricting where they can drill. But again, the report says that something like that is more of a long-term impact solution rather than something that would make a big difference by 2030. But definitely is something that can and probably should be explored. For the industrial sector, the report says that a low carbon government procurement requirement could help encourage the sector to clean up its act faster, since the government is the single largest consumer of goods and services. California currently has that for key construction materials, so that could be implemented for more states as well. Governments could also implement clean product standards, which would put a maximum amount of emissions a given product's production could emit, and then bans the sale of products that go over that maximum, and over time the maximum would then be lowered. This idea still needs to be ironed out more though. It hasn't really been implemented anywhere, so that's something for further exploration. States and the federal government could also push harder to eradicate gas burning appliances from households, either through incentivizing households to make the switch or getting gas burning appliances basically off the market. Currently, 18% of annual state energy efficiency spending actually goes towards gas-powered appliances, because we currently are focused more on reducing energy use and not as much focused on what emissions are actually being produced by those products. So we could redirect that money towards electric appliances to speed up that process. The Clean Air Act could also be implemented and getting gas burning appliances off the market as well. Overall, getting to 50% emissions drop by 2030 is easily said not an easy feat. And honestly, the report emphasized how after that, if we manage to get that goal, the next 50% is going to be even harder. So that's exciting. But it doesn't mean that it can't be done, and we honestly need it to get done. So which policies that were recommended by the Rotem report interested you the most? Does this overall give you maybe a little more hope after hearing that the CEPP was not going to be in the spending package? It did give me a little more hope, admittedly, because there's another avenue. It seems like for the most part there's always another avenue, but I know that will dry up eventually, so, you know, obviously need to act now, need to do what we can now. But anyways, please give me all your thoughts in the comment section below, and if this video was interesting, feel free to share it. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, remember to support your local news organizations and to talk about the climate crisis every single day. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has supported me on Patreon. I greatly appreciate it. A special shout out to the Climate Confident and Courageous patrons David H., FK, and Norman Anal. Thank you very much.